Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover two primary topics. The first one is we're going to review the very extensive polling that was done by IRI, which is the International Republican Institute, which is the international branch of the U.S. Republican Party. We're going to go over the results from their polling in detail, and then we're going to move on to talking about the announced defense budget for Armenia for next year. We're looking at the polling results from IRI in Armenia. The first thing that we notice is the right track, wrong track question, which is the fundamental question: is the country going in the right direction or the wrong direction? And the number is 46% of people in Armenia think that country is going in the right direction, and 40% think that it's going in the wrong direction. These numbers have actually come down, and they've gotten worse since the last survey in December of 23, in which 50% of people thought the country is going in the right direction, and 39% thought that it is not. So it's actually the number of people that are satisfied with the direction of the country is actually decreased. However, still more positive than negative. When you move on to what people identify as the three primary issues facing the country, the first one is national security, naturally, given all the things we need to deal with, is at 41%. The second one, which is economy and jobs, is at 14%. And the third one, which is inflation, is at 10%. Obviously, what we have here is what they call a national security electorate. This is an electorate that is more concerned about security issues and border issues than anything else. And what's interesting of note here is how low the inflation number is compared to other places in the world, because despite the fact that many people think that we have high inflation in Armenia, actually compared to other countries, it's actually quite limited. And we actually saw the results of what high inflation meant, which is one of the primary reasons in the United States that President Donald Trump defeated Vice President Kamala Harris, since inflation is a much bigger issue in the United States. Then we move on to the list of people are asked, which politicians do you trust? And I think we need to be clear with this. People need to volunteer these names. This is not a list of names that people give approval ratings to. When you're asked, who do you trust the most? The first name that comes up is the Prime Minister at 16%. The second name that comes up is Arad Mirzoyan, the Foreign Minister, at 4%. The third one is Aram Sarkisyan, the former Prime Minister and the brother of Vazgen Sarkisyan, at 4%. What's interesting here is that no one mentioned Archbishop Pakrat's name, given the fact that how much press that he got last year. Which means that essentially, as the primary leader of the opposition, his support, or the people that are willing to say that they're supportive of him, has somewhat dissipated. Now we move on to asking the question of, if there were elections coming up this weekend, who would you vote for? First party that comes in is Civil Contract, which is the governing party, the Prime Minister's party, which comes in at 20%. The second party is Gagik Zarukyan's party, the former oligarch and party leader, who comes in, his party comes in at 3%. And then everyone else being the Kocharian coalition, the Republican Party, which is the old party of power in Armenia, and the party of media personality Dog, all come in at 2% each. So what we really have here is a very poor political field in which it's actually a wide open base for other people to enter, as we know. So you have one figure, in this case the Prime Minister, that has a pretty significant but nowhere near majority of voters. A minority of voters does support him against what is in reality a non-existent opposition. There's obviously room for other people. This is wide open room for other people to get into this and become competitive. Then we move on to asking, would you like to see new political parties, which sort of shows the desire for this. And 54% of voters in Armenia are saying they would desire to see new political parties, i.e. new political faces. That number actually becomes 62% when you go to Yerevan. It tells you that in places that people are have higher incomes, are better educated, are more affluent, there's actually a greater desire for political change. 54 said yes, 41 said no, nationally. Then we move on to something that's very interesting, which is we asked a question about constitutional changes. And there's wide opposition to this. There's been a lot of talks about having a constitutional referendum, and it comes in at 24% of people support constitutional referendum and constitutional changes, while 52% oppose it. And I think this is quite interesting, is because obviously we know this is one of the demands of the Azeri regimes to change the Armenian constitution. And I think constitutional change in Armenia is actually being identified with a thuggery of the regime in Baku rather than something that is organic, which is exactly the reason why the regime in Baku will constantly demand this, because they know, one, it'll never pass, and secondly, it'll cause a political crisis inside of Armenia. Then we move on to testing institutions in the country, most credible to least credible. The top institution is the army, that comes in with 64% approval rating, 32% who oppose it. And if you really want to understand this, this has somewhat to do with the reforms that we've seen in the military or the upgrades in the weapon systems, but for the most part, it has to do with us as a society loving our soldiers, because our soldiers are essentially all family members and someone's brother and someone's son. Then we move on to the police, which is the second most credible institution, which has a 61% positive, 35% negative. And what this really tells you is that the police reforms that we've seen over the last few years are actually quite popular. Now, what's interesting, third comes in army leadership, which is at a 49% positive, 45% negative, approval to disapproval. And you notice the difference between the army leadership, which is far less popular than the institution of the army itself, which is something that we've always noted. Then you move on to the church, which has a 48% approval rating and 46% disapproval rating. To put this in context, 2019, the same survey had them at 74% positive, 21% negative, which means that the church has actually taken a step down in popularity over the last few years. Then we move on to the Prime Minister's office, which has a 46% approval rating and a 49% disapproval rating. Why is this number important? Because approval ratings and directions of the country are actually the most best indicators of where the election results are likely to be. And what we're really looking at 46% is really the highest range that the Prime Minister's party is likely to get during the next elections. What you see here is that his support, people that are more willing to vote for him, are actually beyond people who just like him, because there's a lot more people who prefer to have alternatives, but lacking alternatives, he's going to have a significant base of voters somewhere in the low 40s. And in a parliamentary system, low 40s will give you actually clear majorities. Then we move on to one of the least credible institutions in Armenia, which is the courts, which come in at 32% approval rating, 53% disapproval. And this is, again, clearly a result of a lack of judicial reform, or to the extent that we need in Armenia, which has been one of the biggest failures of this current post-revolutionary government. Then we move on to the question about they were asked the biggest failures and accomplishments of this current government in the last 6 months. On the accomplishment side, the first one was the improvement of roads at 12%. Second one was the purchase of weapons, which was at 9%. And the third one is ensuring peace and security, which comes in at 8%. When you move on to the biggest failures of this government, the first one is wrong foreign policy, that comes in at 16%. Second one being wrong policy and personnel decisions, would come in at 12%. And the third one is the demarcation and the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh, that comes in at 12%. Analyzing this, what you really notice is that the Prime Minister has actually done a good job of convincing the voter base of his so-called peace agenda. But at the same time, if you really look at it from the hard politics part of it, he's actually laid himself quite a political trap, because he has promised something which he has absolutely no capacity to deliver, because the regime in Baku will never sign a peace agreement. And what I've learned in politics is that usually the deadliest traps are the ones that you set for yourself. If you really want to know where the politics of this is going, if you look at point 2 and point 3, it's all about strengthening the country and military defense. Once the first point, which is the peace agreement, collapses, which is inevitable prior to the next elections, the issue of the next campaign could very well be who's the most credible leader or party to continue strengthening the country militarily, to go through this period at best of a cold peace that we're entering. So at that point, the Prime Minister either becomes the commander-in-chief, which is something that he actually has the least credibility on, or some other credible party or other leaders will eat his political lunch. Moving on to the second topic of the week, which is the announced defense budget for next year. The defense budget is coming in as $1.7 billion, which, to put this in perspective, it's about 3 times the number that it was in 2020. Overall, public spending expenditures is going to be about $8.9 billion, which again is also a dramatic increase over the last 3 or 4 years, and this is all led by increased better tax revenue collection and economic growth. This means in real terms that our military spending is going to be about 6% of GDP, which is actually 3 times what is NATO minimal standards. And in reality, however, the number is actually higher than that because there's a lot of the spending that it is not accounted for or always announced in specific timeframes. In conclusion, as far as the overall defense spending, as far as I'm concerned, the more the merrier, as long as that spending is actually also married to reforms, and so you're upgrading the personnel side of things, I'm all for it. We should actually likely mandate a minimum GDP portion that should go to the budget, especially as our budgets increase and the economy expands, probably somewhere in the 6 to 8% range, with a certain amount of it guaranteed to go to local firms. This is frankly already happening, but we should sort of codify it into law. In the short term, obviously our goals in all of this, anything military related, is to create complete deterrence. From then on, you need to move to complete equality with our primary enemy. And in the long run, 10 or 15 years, the only goal should be full spectrum dominance and nothing else. This is actually the only rational approach when we're entering the very likely long period of cold peace that we are likely to over the next few decades. Thank you for joining me in this week's episode of Insights.
Sitting on a sofa on a Sunday afternoon, going to the candidates debate, laugh about it, shout about it when you've got to choose. Everywhere you look at it, you lose. Where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio? A nation turns its lonely eyes to you. Ooh, what's that you say?